Welcome to Too Much Review. This is Chad Post. I'm here with Anastasia and Nikolis. Is that how you say your last name correctly?
Yeah.
Brian Wood and Meg Berkobien, whose name I always screw up as well.
No, you...
But I got it now. Brian's name I also screw up. But this is our weekly podcast in which we talk about a particular author or book week by week, bit by bit, enjoying it, appreciating it, finding new things to talk about, and just sort of bringing more attention to these great books that Open Letter has published over the years. And for this season, we've been talking about Merce Rodoreda. We went through her entire selected stories over the past, I think, 5 or 6 episodes. And now we're moving on to Death in Spring, which is her last novel, which was published posthumously. Although, shoot, I had a thing on here about that. But she'd been working on it for a much longer time than before she died. And also, before we get going on this, I do want to say again that on December 12th, at the McNally Jackson store in Williamsburg, the new one, at 7 p.m., Brian, myself, and Maria Christina Hall from the Ramon Yule Institute will be all talking about Death in Spring as a whole, finishing up the last part of it, doing a podcast live at the bookstore at 7 o'clock. That will be accompanied by Spanish wine and cheeses, so come on out to that. If you hear this, if you're in the area, if you're a listener, that would be great. And also send us any questions you have. We have some on GoodReads, and if there's anyone that has anything they want us to address on that last episode, send it along. But, okay, so Meg, let me introduce you properly. Everyone should know Anastasia from the Tómas Jónsson episode. She's a PhD student here at the University of Rochester. Really great reader, really good poet, really good at analyzing texts and talking about, like, the individual lines and bits of them, is absolutely brilliant. And Meg, who used to be a intern here, or I don't know what we called you, apprentice, over a summer, 2 summers ago, I believe.
Yeah. 2 summers.
How many was it?
Yeah, 2 summers.
2. Okay.
Feels like time goes by so quickly, you know.
It's brutal. It's brutal. But Meg is also a Catalan translator who's pursuing her PhD in comparative lit at the University of Michigan. Boo! She received her BA from the same university. Again, boo! Where she studied women's writing in Latin America. Her prose has appeared in Poets and Writers and The Offing, and her translations from Spanish, Catalan, and Galician have been published in Words Without Borders, Anomaly, and A Public Space, to name a few. There's been other ones as well. When she's not translating or teaching, she's working on a dissertation about the politics of reproduction in 19th century Catalan periodicals and museums. So welcome, Meg.
Thank you. I never get to talk about the stuff that I do. So, hey, I'll try not to dominate the conversation.
No, I think that you should, though. At least, especially to start, because you said that you just sent us a picture of Rodoreda's map for the village.
What? What? How did you hold this away from me? This is bonkers.
Yep. So how do you know about Rodoreda? How did you get involved in doing Catalan stuff? Tell us, talk for a bit.
So, when I was a junior in my undergrad program, I took a grad class, and we had 3 weeks to learn Catalan.
What?
A crash course to learn Catalan, only reading Catalan.
Okay.
And then we started reading short stories by Rodoreda, Espriu. Then we went on to novels. We did read La Pe Freda. I know you made a remark about it, and we talked about it before. Cold Skin.
Oh, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, and, and so after a month of really learning Catalan, we went right into reading La Plaça de Diamant.
Okay.
And let me tell you, I did have to come back to it after I studied Catalan for about 4 more years, right?
I'll bet. Even though that's, of all of her books, that's one of the most straightforward ones.
It is. I had to come back to it as well because I was more mature. I think when we read it in the class, everyone was, they didn't understand the way that love worked, like outside of a juvenile frame. That's a lot of what, she writes about. Mature love, kind of how marriage transforms you in different ways as you grow older. And so I appreciated it a lot more after.
I believe, Brian, you're really good at giving marriage advice.
Yeah, we just got a really good gem recently.
By transforms, that's a nice way of saying ruins and withers. But sure.
Yes. I should say, after my first big breakup, could I understand the book better?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Fair enough.
Especially because at the end, when she falls in love, or she doesn't fall in love, and that's the whole point. It's not love. Well, it's a type of love, but whatever. We're not talking about that book so much.
Right.
Yeah. So I actually have the hardcover first edition that you guys brought out.
Ooh, that's rare.
Yeah, I have it, and because I read it.
I don't have it. I don't know where I gave mine away to someone, and we don't have any left.
Yeah,
I purchased my book on eBay. It was like $100 because this one's actually signed by Rodoreda. Yeah, it's an open letter book that's signed by Rodoreda. So I'll be selling it with my personal notes for double the price if anybody wants it. She died in 86, was it?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how could it be an open letter book?
Magic.
I don't know. This same guy was selling an antique CD holder, so I don't know. It seems legit.
Totally legit. So, anyways, when I went to grad school, I shifted completely over to Catalan studies, and so it's been about 9 years of Catalan stuff for me.
Wow.
Love it. Yeah, and I don't translate usually what I study for my PhD. I translate all contemporary stuff.
Okay.
So, usually.
Interesting.
But,
and you went on a trip there not too many years ago, too, and spent some time in Barcelona, right?
Yeah, so I have been back to Barcelona for 3 summers in a row, and I spent 6 months there last year.
That's what it was. Okay.
Yeah,
so you're fully invested in this. You should write a biography of Mercè Rodoreda.
NBD book number 2.
But it would be probably more fun than some of the stuff I'm doing now, to be honest. So
yeah, but the foundation should fund that. Like then, this is really not necessary for the podcast. But at the same time, like all the time that we've been going through this, there is no biography in English. And I don't know what there is in Catalan or Spanish that would be worth translating, or if it would be, but like something along the lines of what Ben Moser did for Clarice Lispector is deserved. And I think there's a lot of stories here because like I always find them because I read her. Like I don't read too much about people's backgrounds usually when I'm reading their books. Like I just don't do that. It's not of interest to me. But then you come across this stuff like I came across the thing where she's having the affair with the married man for so many years. Which is like kind of crazy in light of like all the stories we've been talking about where it's like dudes cheating on their wives 100% of the time or like
so there are ladies that help that facilitate that.
Right. So that's wild. And then one thing, so maybe transitioning a bit to Death in Spring, you said you had some notes about things we'd said on our earlier podcast that were absolutely incorrect, and that's awesome. You should.
Oh no. Correct.
Oh, correct. Okay.
Yeah. So I have all these notes, but you know how you were talking first about, you were trying to think about analogous writers.
Right.
At the time, and you were thinking modernism, all of that kind of stuff. Well, so Rodoreda, I'm not interested in bio stuff either that much, but I do like to know what they were reading.
Okay.
What authors were reading. So a lot of the stuff in the 40s, so the stories you were reading were based in a kind of paradigm set by Hemingway. And you had mentioned Hemingway a lot in that behavioralism model.
Yeah.
And really when we get to Death in Spring, things switch around, right?
Right.
I only mentioned that because that's the only writer I'd ever read. So it's the only reference. I just got lucky. It's very lucky that it aligned like that. So, woohoo! All right.
Way, and actually she adored Faulkner.
Okay.
She spoke about Light in August.
Yeah.
In a lot of different ways, especially, women, pregnancy, kind of traversing the earth, the vegetation. You were talking about gardening. All of that comes together.
We talk about gardening all the time.
And so we have a lot to say about that today, don't we?
Oh, yeah.
But first, I would also say about you. We also talked about David. You guys talked about David Rosenthal's translation,
Yes.
which was In the Time of the Doves. Now, I actually think this is a fantastic translation, although, as you pointed out, that title is so misleading.
Yeah.
Because, pigeons are not doves, obviously. And many people always say that pigeons are Barcelona's animal. Like in Ukraine, Kiev, it's like loose dogs. In Istanbul, it's cats. Yeah, it's pigeons here. And at this time, basically, Rodoreda was reading a lot of Kafka, a lot of Sartre, and she really, with the pigeon, she has this line. She said, "I wanted it really to be like Kafka-esque, so Kafka-esque, like all of the pigeons coming at all times. I wanted it to be absurd." And so, yeah. I think those little points do tend to matter because she just wanted everything to be so strange, like in War, So Much War, or in, Death and Spring.
So, so getting into Death and Spring, I'll try and recap this in the first section. We're talking about, in case I didn't mention this earlier, the first part of the book, which is pages 1 through 27. But one thing on her bio on the Foundation's website, it says in 1961, she entered Death and Spring in the Sant Jordi Award competition, again unsuccessfully. It was published posthumously in 1986. So my impression was that she had been working on this for a very long time, since the 50s, right?
So what happened, and so the affair, the guy that she was sleeping with or whatever, we can say his name was Joan Prat. And so what we know is from her letters to him, basically, she was really, really bummed that she didn't get that prize.
Okay.
When she first submitted it. And he wrote back and he said, "I'm actually really glad this happened because now you can finally work on it and not be thinking about prizes." Oh. And one of the good things one critic said about it was that even though it's unfinished, it's unfinished, but it's not incomplete.
Right.
And I think that's really important because I went through the different versions this week.
Wow.
And they're all neatly collected, right? So it wasn't that hard. But the main differences are really getting weird specifics into the text. Let me see what Rodoreda said. She said she wanted to improve how she said things to make them the most unexpected possible. She wanted to add more voices in, although it's all, first person. She wanted to give different points of view. And Joan Prat said, you need to add in some action so that things actually happen in it.
Like people burying themselves in trees.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So she spent that time rewriting, over and over to really make things stranger, to make them more Kafkaesque, and to have things go on.
Very cool. Very interesting. So that's awesome, and it's great to talk to you at this point too, as we're sort of beginning the journey into Death and Spring, so that you can help frame all of this too.
I'm just really glad to hear that she was a loser, and didn't win stuff, because that's happening to me a lot right now. Submitting stuff, it's like, oh, sweet, there's still hope.
25 years from now, your collection can come out.
25 years after you die, Brian.
Yeah, I'll be dead in 25 years probably. So that's cool.
Oh no. Anastasia, do you want to try and describe this first part? Since you've been...
I have two thoughts after that really awesome background from Meg. So I study American poetry, so we'll see how I do. But two things. One, dude, if I had heard from my lover, like, oh, I'm really glad that you didn't win that prize so you can keep working on this, dude, I would have, like, flipped a fucking table. Like, hell no. One. Two, it is interesting what you're saying that, like, the idea of needing to kind of pare down or change the description so that in order to make things happen. So one of the things I think is really interesting about this opening is that there's a lot of weird stuff that happens, right? There's a lot of weird stuff and weird things, but fundamentally, there's like not a ton of plot progression. It's mostly, one of the big things that I was really focused on was how the descriptions kind of kept accruing, that there's this kind of accrual feeling, and there's a lot of kind of returning. So like there's a lot of repetition where we like all of a sudden, so like the difference between pages 7 and page 8, where we get like, at the end of page 8, the chapter ends with, that is why every year a man entered the water on the upper side and swam under the village and came out on the lower side, sometimes dead, sometimes without a face because it had been ripped away when the desperate water hurled him against the rocks that supported the village. That's basically almost verbatim repeated from the page before. And it's not plot progressive, it's mostly descriptive. But in this weird way, things do happen, even though in a lot of ways it's more about looking and observing, and kind of categorizing and like cataloging. And I think that has been the most enjoyable part of this for me. I study description and the way that description kind of is formed in poems, and the way that we can use that to create identity. But I don't usually think of it all that much about how we use that to create world building, which is obviously kind of a genre thing that we think about when we're talking about fantasy. And I think what's really interesting in this piece is we do get the sense that this is part of identity formation, this is part of plot progression, but fundamentally it's about like looking at weird shit and talking about how weird it is.
Yeah, and this is a book in which the world is being described. Like, what is this village like? The thing that I kept marking that I'm going to by the time this goes live, there'll be a post about this as well, is all the myths and rituals that are in this section. But basically, to try and encapsulate the little bit of the plot there's a young boy, for the narrator's a 14-year-old young boy who goes to swim in the water, thinks about some stuff, gets out of the water, sees his dad chopping open a tree to bury himself inside of it, goes to tell the blacksmith about this, and then everyone from the village runs to the forest, pulls the dad out of the tree to fill his mouth with cement so that his soul can't escape before he dies, and then has a fiesta.
Puts him back in the tree.
Put him back in the tree because that's where you get buried. And then there's all the little rituals or the things that come up. Like there's the reference to the way you just said, Anastasia, about the people swim through the river that goes under the village every year to clear out the rocks so that the village isn't like upended and destroyed. There's anytime that the parents go to the adults go to the forest, they lock their kids in these cupboards with little stars to breathe through sometimes, and sometimes they forget them there and they kind of pass out. There's a reference.
That's way cheaper than babysitting, though. So I could see. I have a 2-year-old. I get it a little bit.
That is so much better.
Well, nowadays you could put them in the cupboard with an iPad and Barney, and you're good.
Probably for the next week.
Yeah.
Especially if you give them some gummies or something like that. I don't know. Can they eat gummies when they're 2?
Sure. Why not? There's also 2 references to the prisoner, who will come up later, but they're just sort of sly asides in here. There's another one that I marked, but I can't remember what it is now. But about how they kill the horses. The missing faces is part of the swimming thing.
I know, but that's like weird.
But there's also like the idea that the kids don't look like their fathers because when the women are pregnant, they're blindfolded, so they don't look at other men because then the child will end to look up like that man who they fall in love with instantly. Yeah. This is crazy. This is, if you just said this, like, and it wasn't written in such an insane, incredibly amazing way, you'd be like, this sounds like the most batshit bonkers, like, book or movie ever. But it's so poetic, and it's so precise, and it's so much all of the things that she's been doing that it works really well. I think.
Yeah, I think one of the things you might have forgotten is the caramens, like, which for me feels like a winter is coming. Those frozen dead people are coming. This enemy that they don't really ever identify.
I underlined a great part about that, which is right here. Well, this is sort of related to that on page 18, where it says, they say that one night, not at the bottom of the slope, but on the ground, on the rocks hurled from the cliff, the moon showed two shadows joined at the mouth, and it rained blood. That is how it all began.
Oh, God.
Sounds like she's just writing lyrics for Slayer there. It's not a big deal. Whatever. So she was into death metal before it existed. Big deal.
Cool.
Ahead of her time.
What did you think, Brian, in relation to the stories?
I enjoyed this tremendously. It still has the really tight, precise wording, the economy of description, which I really liked. I think it's just doubly so with this. It reminded me a lot of reading. I know I was talking with Anastasia about it before, about reading the King James Bible. It has some of the most tightly coiled words, like cleft. They use the word cleft when talking about rocks. In the King James, they talk about, I think it was Moses had to hide himself in the cleft of a rock as God walked by, or cleave is from Genesis, that a man must cleave to his wife. So there's some really cool, super energetic old school words that are just, I think it's beautiful and lovely with all the death and beauty juxtaposed in this.
I honestly thought when you said that you're talking about a book that you were going to talk about the giving tree.
Ironically, I was reading that to my daughter as I was reading this. I was like, oh yeah, so yeah, we do get stuff from trees, I guess.
I want to say that we should probably thank Martha Tennant for a lot of that too, because she brought in that cleft. Having read the Catalan, I think, she really worked these sentences so wonderfully. So.
I was going to say that too, and I was going to ask you specifically. I remember when Martha, when she translated this for us, this was one of our very first books. This was the first season. That's why you have the hardcover, because that only lasted for a year. It was right at the beginning. She translated it. She came to the U of R to do an event with Kathleen McNerney, who we were talking about beforehand too, who's written the two, or put together the two books about Rodoreda's fiction that are the two main ones that are available in English anyways. And when Martha was here, the one thing that she kept talking about was coming up with upwrenched. And the upwrench shows up in here 3 times as the wisteria upwrenches the houses. Yeah. And it was a word that's not, I don't even know if it's really an English word. I mean, it feels like it is. And if it's not, it makes sense anyways. But I don't remember if it was what it was in Catalan or what she was doing that with. But I know that was one that she was very proud of, because she thought that really got at what the text was trying to do.
Yeah, I could not tell you which word it is, but upwrenched is fantastic.
Yeah.
Right. If only because it kind of, one of the things that Rodoreda does really well is takes all the motifs of vegetation and what it means to be man and plant and horse and mixes them in terrifying ways, usually through specific verbs, by placing unexpected verbs or adjectives together. So upwrenched really has that sense of it shouldn't be there, but it is. So yeah, I couldn't tell you that one though.
Yeah.
I like the way too that it's both beautiful and dangerous at the same time. I don't know why I read this recently, but I was showing Chad the very beginning opening to Grapes of Wrath 2 weeks ago, and it has just this beautiful it starts with this beautiful landscape and describing the way the clouds and the earth and the grasses look, and there's something just terrible and ominous at the same time. And I kept getting this vibe with the description of nature in this as well. It's so beautiful and just frightening at the same time.
So Meg, what do you make of all the garden stuff?
Ooh, so it is hard. Partly because, you've been talking about the way gardens function in the short stories, and in the forthcoming book, I feel like the flowers play a different role than vegetation does here, right? So, in just that, Anastasia, you said the cataloging. kind of thing. I'm trying to think through that a bit now still. But for me, just saying, I would say that like all the forms of life come together. And for example, women become butterflies and then the butterflies become women. Think about when that description of the cave becomes like the raw and red gums of old men. And then we have the idea of the men's faces being ripped off and left raw. And then that goes into a way in which they place the raw horse meat and brains into their mouths.
Right.
And then women are scooping and flinging balls of fat and cooked blood to the ground. And then, you know, the stepmother, it then picks up and plays with the balls of fat only to eat them in like the dark.
Right.
And like finally just that image of the tree digesting his father. And digesting is the word that Tennant picked, right?
Yeah, and you got to have digesting paste. Don't forget that. Because a nice heavy meal of horse, you want to have it smooth. Brought to you by Digesting Paste. Digesting Paste for when you have your horse meal and horse blood and brains. You want digesting paste.
But only one spoonful or else you'll go mad.
Yeah.
One spoonful of mashed up horse fetus.
That's that really fast
brain,
part at the end of the commercial where they give you all of the side effects. Yeah. Side effects may include brain damage,
For me, I know that Rodoreda was really interested in natural sciences, especially the human body. And I see this worked out probably in Death in Spring and more than any other book. Just that cruel nature that you were talking about, Brian. It's terrifying, it's beautiful, but it's ultimately cruel, just like the people are cruel.
Yeah. I mean, and not to jump ahead too much, but I mean, I just loved, like, having read the short stories, as soon as I read this first paragraph with like this wonderful like boy playing with a bee and trying to avoid a bee, and I'm like, oh, this is going to end terrible. And it ends with him like just stomping it into the ground, right? Like that wonderful like innocence of like, man, it really makes me wish it was summer and like I could go somewhere and watch a bee and butterflies and go swimming. And you know, its book ended with just killing and destroying the bee because he's seen all of this awful stuff once he finally got out of the cupboard. Innocence is gone, and we're in for a rough ride here.
This is very true. One of my favorite lines that relates to that is when he's in the forest. Let me see if I can find it. But he's in the forest and they're like pulling his dad out and all that kind of stuff. And there's a person standing next to him. The person leans over. He's like, "I like watching people die."
I love that.
Yep.
Man, fuck that, dude. I feel like peace.
Yeah, exactly.
Walking away.
This book is so intense.
Yep.
I just imagine him like leaning down and whispering it. Psst, I love watching him die. Like, okay, bye, mister.
Yeah. This is why we stay in the cupboard. So you also, in your email to me, you mentioned you said there's some topics that you wanted to talk about, most of which we've talked about, but one we haven't that I'm really curious about is dead babies in Catalan culture.
What?
Oh, that was probably more eye-catching than it should have been. But, you know, this idea of dead babies, I think that everyone should be writing about dead babies because that's how you get people. I actually taught a class here with one of the David Foster Wallace story that you were talking about.
Oh shit, that story is intense.
Fuck that story.
Yeah.
I taught them in tandem because it's like, you know, consider the lobster. You're putting a lobster in boiling water and thinking about the boiling water and the child and thinking about what happens when someone can't translate their pain into words.
Doesn't he also have that saying about like working on a novel is like carrying around a deformed fetus? Or there's another deformed baby quote of his. I can't remember it exactly, but
also fuck you. You're not a mother. Get out of here.
No, we are pregnant. No, I'm pregnant, asshole.
So the other great, I mean, Rodoreda is probably the best modernist. I don't know how you would describe. I mean, I think about Catalina Albert, or Victor Catala was her pen name.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were going to talk about.
Yeah, and I think I sent you one of my translations, Chad, when we were doing it, and when I was at Open Letter, and we didn't get to it. But it's definitely this realist idea, this coming from the country of Jesus Christ, just taking things out on kids, the way that kids were involved in the nefarious deeds of adults. The story I sent was about basically this old woman who convinced a little girl to stuff enough bread into her little brother's mouth to kill him. so that later on she could have her son marry that little girl and inherit all the land.
Jesus Christ.
That is just like, that's the tradition, this is coming from. And it is fucked. And I try to think, right? And we have we must have that in American Lit, but I feel like I don't read enough American Lit to actually get to that. For me, it must be like, should I say like Shirley Jackson?
Right.
I feel like that's when you went to.
That's like half the episodes of that show Dallas was something like that, like trying to get my oil inheritance, or minus the bread, but
it really does read like Gothic fiction.
Yeah.
But fucked. Yeah, so that's a really important thread for me, just thinking about the brutality of family life that was only worsened, with the Civil War.
God, yeah.
So, yeah, dead babies.
Wow. So, I do think this is. And you think this is one of the best books ever written too, right?
Oh yeah, hands down.
Yeah,
this is amazing.
Yeah, and you can tell right away, like just in that first paragraph, like you were saying, Brian, with the B, and in Martha's translation, and it's shining through. Like this is so precise and so wonderful and so engaging right from the get go. Like I don't understand. I mean, it's one of our best-selling books, but I still do not understand why it hasn't sold like 30,000 copies. This is so much better than a lot of people that have gotten a lot of attention recently.
This will be a super random comparison, but it kind of reminds me, like the precision of the language. It reminds me of, I can never say his name right, J.M. Coetzee. I just read one of his books a couple years ago, Waiting for the Barbarians, which is dealing with apartheid and all that kind of stuff with a parable of sorts. But just the way it's kind of strange, the culture doesn't make any sense, and the way it's describing it with this really interesting, beautiful, vivid language that's super pinpoint. Like this is exactly like right up in there with like, it's so good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So where did this map come from that you sent us the picture of?
So it's from that same book that it's a collection of all the different versions.
Oh, okay.
So
we have a bunch of our books like that, but I don't know if we have this one.
So yeah, this one is in Catalan. So, the thing is, I would say that part of the reason why her work isn't as well known in the public sphere is also because it's not talked enough in like the university sphere either. And a lot of that is because, well, usually men get translated,
right?
Especially from Spain, right? And books are brought out on men. So
well, we can back it up even further than that. Coming from public education, I just learned Catalan's a thing not too long ago. We can back it up even in broader strokes, even.
And there were reasons. I mean, there were
true.
There were reasons why that wasn't brought up in America, right? Like the U.S. had weird kind of negotiations with Spain and the dictatorship at that time.
One thing I would also want to float a little bit is because one of the things we're one of the things that we're kind of highlighting about Rodoreda is the way that she describes, and description was considered a very feminine mode of writing, especially among the modernists. So that was basically what distinguished Marianne Moore from T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, was the description. And that's why Ezra Pound was very careful not to describe his Imagist poems as descriptive. They were Imagist, because description was considered feminine, and inactive, and was like a lot of the female writers would kind of downplay their achievements by saying little bits of description, especially because
I'm imagining Ezra Pound. That's not pink. That's salmon.
Right. I think you mean that's bright red. So I could also imagine that Rodoreda wouldn't have had a lot of traction among the modernists of that time period, even if she were kind of discussed and present, because you had to fight pretty hard to have that kind of writing be recognized and be valued. You almost had to kind of denigrate yourself or almost make fun of yourself, which is why Marianne Moore was so careful to call her book Observations. She leaned right into the fact that everybody was going to kind of make fun of her and not respect it. Yeah. That's also why Virginia Woolf did a similar game of really foregrounding like structural elements in her novels, even though like To the Lighthouse is inherently an ekphrastic novel, which is describing another piece of artwork. She didn't draw a lot of attention to that description when she would talk about it with other people. She would talk about the actual larger structural elements of the book.
Right. I just hope that like someone who's writing from 1950 or publishing from 1950 through the late 80s, that you would overcome some of that bias along the way. But
no, Elizabeth Bishop is publishing her poems from 45 to 75.
Yeah.
And she actually specifically always she's included. They try to include her in a volume about the greatest American poetess because of her descriptions. And so she's like, I don't think so, guys. Like, go home, y'all drunk.
Poetess.
I think she said something like, I hate that term.
I mean, we also have to consider the politics of publishing in Catalan at this time.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Abroad. And I think there was a lot at stake in not having her be someone who won one of those prizes. Specifically and she was also, I mean, she lived in Paris at first, but then she was in Geneva, and she was very like by herself in that little world. So I don't know. I think everything you just said about description and Virginia Woolf, and she would have been in conversation with those people, or at least her work would have been. But I don't think it would have been respected. She was the one who was supposed to respect the others. Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, man. Well, hopefully this will start to change. And everyone will start teaching her books. The world will become a more just place. People read things that aren't Game of Thrones.
Exactly. This is just as good as Game of Thrones. Come on.
What? Better. What?
Yeah. Just
what? Wait. Let's read about some dead people in trees, because I think we can. Like, what? Red Wedding? My ass. Come on. Like, I don't care how violent you think that shit is. Like, oh my god, this is so much weirder.
And I love that the people in trees isn't. I mean, that's not her idea originally, right? It's such a big idea in indigenous cosmogony, which was another area she was really interested in.
Yeah.
Right. Thinking about the ways that anthropology was working its way into literary culture at the time, and I myself am still trying to think through what cosmogony in this novel means, especially with El Señor, right?
Yeah. Because he's so ominous in this first part is very ominous.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's hard not to talk about the whole novel.
It really is, but yeah.
Because they keep describing him with there's the ivy, right? That's fiery and then dies.
Right.
It's described 2 or 3 times, I think, every time it's discussed.
There's even a line, too, about where he says, he says, at times when I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I thought how I wanted to bring Senor crashing down, especially in winter when it snowed, or help the roots upwrench houses, or walk the horses on Maraldina where no one had ever been. And there's another part where he says something like he looked up at the hill and could imagine Senor looking down at everyone. Mm-hmm. And it's got like a more ominous bit to it, but I can't find that one.
See, that's just winter is coming. It's a nicer way of saying it.
Yeah.
Here we go. This is it. Then this is fucking amazing. I forgot. This is better than I remember it. I could see Senor in my thoughts, coughing and eating honey, waiting always for the river to carry away the village.
Yeah.
so yes. And it is a book that creates its own universe too. Like there's a lot of like, it's creating a village and like what these rituals are, what these myths are, what they believe in. And it is very sort of cyclical. It's death in spring. There's that kind of component to it. And I think as we go along, we're going to see that kind of develop outwards and in a lot of different ways.
I did want to ask a question because I don't know a lot about Catalan context. Is this kind of world building in American lit is often kind of sidelined to genre fiction, right? Or it's considered sci-fi or dystopian. We have all these words to say like, oh, that's not real literature. That's this kind of literature, right? Does that happen in Catalan too? Or is that just kind of like a fun American thing?
Well, I mean, even I'm thinking about magical realism here. And
right.
You know how that's a term that often, is meant to categorize and keep disciplines up and genres up. But overall, I would think that I would term it like speculative fiction in a way that crosses genres.
Right.
It's hard to say now, and it's hard to say then because God, Catalan was banned, right?
Yeah.
Right. But if you think about Cold Skin, for example, or other kind of more speculative fiction, it's really important. And there are actually, the more I think about it, the more examples there are, especially right after and right before the dictatorship ended, of science fiction and speculative fiction works that were really literary, as they were trying to kind of rethink about what kind of world would there be, right?
Yeah.
Like what world they were living in then, what it meant to be Catalan, and how that might look when Franco, died. Would he? And I think, I don't like talking about politics all that much because though I know them, I don't know the complexity of the situation as much. But, I think that in a regime like that, speculative fiction is the genre to kind of negotiate all those terms.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can kind of parallel that with the way that speculative fiction and dystopian literature kind of shows up around the Cold War and things like that, right? So, but it's interesting because a lot of that, it takes so long for that to get kind of respected as literature and not just as like a fun game or like some kind of like weird experiment, right?
Yep, absolutely.
But I think right now there's so much recuperation, right? In Catalan literature in general, that everything kind of feels like literature as long as it's written in Catalan. And some people might disagree with me, but that's, as someone who's reading a lot of Catalan literature, that's how it feels.
That's an interesting idea too. When could you start publishing in Spain in Catalan again?
Well, there were like, I'd have to go back to the dates, but there was kind of like, within the 60s and 70s, maybe even the 50s, a kind of unfreezing a little bit, just like with the Cold War, right? It's just like regimes were kind of starting to change a bit. So I think that some things were published within Catalonia. And if I get this wrong, I'm so sorry. But I think that there were some publishing houses that were trying to bring a few things out, at least.
I don't know where I saw it. I thought I just saw it in this book this morning, but weren't there like signs throughout Barcelona that said, don't bark, speak Spanish?
Yes, that was just like right before the dictatorship, right?
Yeah.
Sounds like fake news.
It is fucking brutal, dude, to read that stuff.
Dude, that's awful.
And wonder, and a lot of the problems now, you know, in the past 10 years, as the independence movement has kind of gained ground, of course, the state is coming in and saying, like, oh, do we really need bilingual education? You know, like, shouldn't they be learning English instead of Catalan? Like, what?
It would make it a lot easier for when I travel there. I mean, just to be a little selfish, it would be nice if everybody spoke my language wherever I went. It'd be very helpful.
So you just go to Toronto all the time?
Yeah, I know.
So we should probably wrap this up. Anastasia, what was your favorite line from this section?
Oh God. Yeah. I knew you were going to ask me that, and I even starred a million, and I still have no idea what to pick because there were just so many. Because there were some that were just beautiful, and there were some that were just so bizarre, and I actually had a very hard time choosing because of that. But here's one. You're
choosing the same one that I was going to. I was going to find a new one.
Okay. It's on page 21, at the end of the paragraph at the top of the page. I would end my days locked in that tree, my mouth full of cement that had been mixed with crimson powder, my entire soul within. Because, you see, the blacksmith used to say that with the last breath, without anyone realizing, your soul flees, and no one knows where it goes.
I underlined that same one and said, if somebody picks this, they're definitely not reading this correctly and aren't paying attention.
Oh yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I wrote all of that in the
margins.
There's a lot of room.
Yeah.
Oh man, what's your favorite?
I have one underlined that fits in perfect with that. It's page 5. I thought it was slightly lame when I first read it, but now it's brilliant because it just takes me a while to catch up. Souls have no mouths, so they spoke to us through the voice of the wind. So even just with the mouth and the soul and that echoing that's throughout the entire first part of it, it's just, this must have taken 30 years to write because it's layered, it's stitched together, it's all there.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey Meg, what's your favorite?
Oh, you go first. I was trying to find it.
Okay. Mine is on 15, and it's, I stopped by the edge of the river and covered my ears with my open hands so I would not hear the quiet.
Oh, that's probably the second worst line in this whole section. What are you guys doing over there at the U of R campus? Come on. Meg, can you please pick a good one?
Yeah,
Thank
it's not
you.
going to be a good one.
Let's end on a strong note for once.
I like the description of the man with the face torn off, right?
Oh, yeah.
The man who approached carried an axe on his shoulder and a pitchfork in hand. He was naked from the waist up, his forehead smashed. His face had been disfigured by the rushing river, and he was unable to shut his eyes because the skin on his forehead had healed poorly. His red, shrunken skin was pulled tight, always leaving a slit in his eye. He had patches of black hair on his chest, and his body was sunburned. That's one of my favorite. The attention to the body there. Even the last part, the sunburn part, hits even harder after all of the discussion of the face. I don't know. That's me.
Man. This is a great book. She's a great writer.
Bow down to her.
Absolutely. Anyway, so I think we'll leave it there for now. But next week we'll be going over part 2, which is pages 31 through 58, I believe. If I can find, I don't know, 68. 31 through 68. That's exactly what it is.
Hopefully there'll be like a love interest, because if you want a book to sell, you got to have a love interest somewhere in there.
Oh, well, there's love.
There is love. Please take note that the stepmom is 16. We didn't bring that up.
Oh dear, somehow I get the feeling this isn't going to be really sexy. Oh no.
Oh boy. All right. Well, thank you, Meg, for joining us, and thanks, Anastasia, and thanks, Brian. Well, I will talk to you very soon.